Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. We're heading into week 5. We're going to talk about some of the games to look for and have a chat with friend of the program, Matt Stahl of AL.com, about the upcoming game between the Georgia Bulldogs and Alabama Crimson Tide. Great stuff to talk about. Thank you for tuning in. But before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Sean, I don't know. I almost want to immediately ask about did you have any verbal promises that you can or cannot commit to? Because for those who were listening to our last episode, we were debating about, do we replace the G5 team in our survivor pool with UNLV? And my goodness, did that conversation change? We decided, no, let's do Boise State. NIU lost. Let's do Boise State, and AP even ranked them number 25. But I mean, we can. I mean, I know we want to probably start with our guest, because I know he's got a bit of a time commitment. But I really hope we get a chance towards the end to talk about what's going on with Sluka, because my goodness. And then like the kind of like, oh, people are paying attention. I'm also transferring for totally unrelated reasons. But my goodness, this has been.
Well, if you listen to the UNLV players on Twitter, all of them are like, good, bye. Let's put in our good quarterback now. It's been quite a reaction. I'm sure everybody's just a little bit on edge, and I totally get that. Let's introduce our guest. We've got our good friend.
Yes, absolutely. I just had to toss it in there because
I know. Well, I also want to get his thoughts on this. We've got Matt Stahl from AL.com, of course. He's been on the show many times before, covers Alabama, does a great job. Look, I mean, I think that we all knew that something like this was inevitable. We saw before a season with the Jaden Rashada situation where he doesn't enroll at Florida, but this is so weird to have a guy leave.
We saw an echo with Bear Alexander, because I remember back in April, he's like, oh, is he leaving? And then he's like, no, I'm not leaving. And everyone's like, okay, they secured the bag. And then now it's like the depth chart apparently is also an issue, because he was talking about playtime within 24 hours. I think what Sluka did is he set up what a lot of players want to copy, which is like, oh yeah, right, I've only played 3 games. I can redshirt, so this season doesn't really count. And now I can take my talents elsewhere. So this is going to be an interesting time. But, first, I want to get back to our guest here, Matt Stahl, as you said, friend of the show. We've had him on a couple of times. We always love talking, especially Alabama football, with him. We got an interesting game this weekend. Obviously, College Game Day is going to be here. It's as big as everyone expected it to be. Number 4, Alabama heading over to number 2, Georgia. I think the only thing that's even remotely surprising is Georgia lost the number 1 spot to Texas for legitimate reasons. And we'll see another game of the century probably later on this season when whoever wins plays them. But wanted to welcome you here. I mean, another thing to note, Alabama's a slight underdog, the first time since I believe 2007 with LSU that's happened at home. Just a remarkable kind of set of circumstances here. But Matt, how are you, man? How is everything going?
It's good. Yeah, going. The Alabama dynasty has not quite crumbled yet. So 3-0 despite Nick Saban being gone. So there's not torches and pitchforks out yet. But also, I mean, I don't think Wisconsin is good at all.
What gave that away? But what about with their backup quarterback? Are they even better that way?
Turns out, no, this isn't a UNLV situation. Yeah, that one, boy, you could tell it was bad from the press box, as soon as he went down. And you're like, I don't even know who this backup quarterback is. I don't even remember him from, recruiting.
Fun fact, he is from my backyard, from Rockwall, Texas, and he was actually the high school quarterback of Jackson Smith and Jigba. So actually, so he is known in Texas high school circles. He ended up at Mississippi State, wasn't an especially heralded recruit. Was part of that wave of guys who came in whenever they were we're going to go full Phil Longo, and the quarterbacks that we have here don't know how to go full Phil Longo. But all that to say, I don't think he's quite ready right this second to be the starting quarterback at Wisconsin.
No, he's certainly not. He's certainly not going to make the Badgers anywhere approaching what Georgia is coming into this game. So, a first real test for Alabama coming up. Well, first real test after the G5 team. You guys should really be talking about the Western Kentucky Hilltoppers, the powerhouse of Conference USA.
I mean, we can joke, but they knocked off Memphis, which just totally took them out of the picture. Which is, I love how messy this part of the season is, where you just can't predict. As we're talking about NIU, and then Buffalo just decided to march into town, and you can't look past those Bulls. Oh no, G5 is amazing right now.
Yeah, the big reason that we wanted to have you on is, of course, we have this big game, the Alabama versus Georgia game, one of the big games of the year. Everybody had it circled to start the year. I think for the most part, it's lived up to the hype so far this season. But we wanted to check in with Alabama. It's been a few weeks. We're starting to see what the Kalen DeBoer era looks like in relation to the Nick Saban era. So I want to start with that. You got to cover the final year of Nick Saban. You're getting to cover the first year of Kalen DeBoer. I'm curious, for you, what's the most different thing about these two programs? First, I mean, I'm sure that some of it with like covering the team is a little bit different, but also in terms of what they're actually doing on the football field.
I mean, coverage-wise, we've talked to Ryan Williams twice. That's crazy. That Jalen Hurts was the starting quarterback as a freshman all year. Was that 16?
Yep.
And they just didn't talk to him up until like the bowl game. There was there's no talking to freshmen previously. That's new. But on the field, things are going fine. Defense has looked really solid, going to the more of the Kane Womack, playing the 4-2-5, what he calls the swarm D, versus, there was years and years and years of the Nick Saban kind of 3-4 with the pattern matching and like the system that would make your head explode, but really worked when it worked, which it did for, the entire time. So, that's different. Offensively, like I said, Ryan Williams, they got a guy, a wide receiver that hasn't been kind of the case in a few years. Jalen Milroe, it seems like Jalen Milroe just looked really, really comfortable in the offense so far when the offensive line is all together, which, Caden Proctor got injured in pregame warmups before the Western Kentucky game, which is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. But they finally got like their best five out there for Wisconsin, and it looked really good. It almost seems like the offense maybe plays more to Jalen Milroe's talents than they were under Tommy Rees last season. There's some more, there's some design runs that I think are a really smart way to use him. They're attacking deep. They're doing all the stuff that Jalen Milroe does really well. And, it's working so far. We'll see if it works against Georgia.
That's an interesting question. From what you've observed in this transition between obviously last year's team under Saban and this year's team, especially under Kalen DeBoer and Nick Sheridan, how does Jalen Milroe's game change from what you've observed? Are there things that you've seen, nuances, changes to how he's performing out there that you would attribute to this kind of change in strategy and leadership?
Yeah, he looks more comfortable running the ball, which, he always had like crazy speed, he's elusive. If you get him running downhill, it's going to be a bad day for you. But they're using him on design runs more, I think, is a big thing, which, you should. He's he's an extra number in the run game. And he's just he might be the best runner on the team, in addition to just incredible arm talent. So it could just be he's a year older, looks a lot more comfortable in kind of all facets of his game, but he's more willing to run. I think he maybe gets a little more of a green light. He doesn't feel like he necessarily has to sit there and prove I can stand here and throw the ball. But, DeBoer came in and there were some questions about whether Milroe be able to do what Michael Penix did at Washington. But it's not the case, right? It's just, DeBoer said from day one, literally day one, we're just going to do what we do around the personnel that we have, right? So if your playbook is this is not good podcasting. I realize as I stick my hands in the air, but if your playbook is super thick. Like your playbook's like 6 inches thick. You might use 2 inches of it for Michael Penix and then like a totally different 2 inches of it for Jalen Milroe. So yeah, I it's just different, I think, from what they were doing at Washington, but Jalen seems very comfortable so far.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, obviously, this wasn't going to be a program that moments after Saban left would just fall apart. I mean, I think that they put out the 247 talent composite. I believe Alabama's still number one, even after losing some of the guys that they did, which is such a testament to the way that they recruit. But, I'm curious, like, have you seen, like, does it still feel like Alabama? Like, does it still feel like when Saban was the coach? Like, does it still feel like when teams play against them, hey, like, they still kind of have the fear of God like they did when it was Saban's Alabama? Or do you feel like teams are a little more fearless going against the new coaching staff?
I think they're more fearless than they used to be, but it wasn't like it didn't start with the DeBoer transition, right? Like, I think some, and obviously not the like mid-tier teams of the world, but like your Texas, your Georgia, your Ohio State, your Michigan last year, like they weren't scared of Alabama coming in for a few seasons now. So I mean, it's this, in that sense, I think it's the same. Like, I don't think Georgia's going to come out and be like, oh no, what do we do against the mighty Crimson Tide of Alabama? But, that's not a DeBoer thing. And yeah, it does still very much feel like Alabama. And that's in part player led, like a lot of the really key guys from last year's team, be it Jalen, be it Tyler Booker on the offensive line, Malachi Moore at safety, the culture, I don't think changed a whole lot there. So when you're talking to people in there, it still very much feels like Alabama.
What do you think has over, because I totally see what you're saying here, and you can see it on the field with the idea that those top tier teams don't seem to have that level of fear. Do you think what do you think causes that over time? Do you think it's I I hesitate to say it doesn't seem like, is it Alabama necessarily looking weaker, or is it the sort of the rising tides of all the programs that have been chasing after what had succeeded at Alabama? How do you think that dynamic has changed?
I guess it's maybe a little bit of both, right? Like I said, Alabama after that 2020 season, which I mean, probably the best defense we've ever seen, like unbelievable team there. But like, I think they lost a little bit in the portal era, like in the early days of NIL with Saban, weren't they weren't where they needed to be on that, and Saban was a little slow. I mean, you saw from the Jimbo thing that he was maybe a little slow on the uptake with some of the NIL stuff. So, I mean, that probably didn't help him. But yeah, then it was just like Kirby stacking class on class on class on class. It's Sark making Texas competent, right? It's Jim Harbaugh finally doing what he needed to do at Michigan, turning that team into just nightmare fuel for anybody. So I think, yeah, a little bit of both.
So in these first couple of games, right, we got like the South Florida kind of weirdness, which ironically the way that kind of happened last season. How has Kalen DeBoer handled the job? Like, how he obviously was somebody who came in from the West Coast, the football culture obviously a little different there, had never coached anywhere near the SEC or the Southeast. How has he handled the pressure of being a head coach? How did he handle after that South Florida game some of the adversity of being Alabama's coach, and how do you think he's kind of fit into that role?
I think he's done everything right. From the beginning, literally the first question I asked him when they introduced him in Tuscaloosa was like, why do you want to follow Nick Saban? And he said all the right things on that front. He's, embraced kind of what Saban built here. He's not seen it as like, oh, I have to come in and change everything. It's time to break out the funky uniforms at Alabama. And, what if, but I'm trying to think of some like flashy college football program thing to do, but like the closest thing I can come for him was he brought an ice cream truck to practice one day, and like people lost their minds over it. And it's the most Alabama coverage thing, right? Like we're writing about like, oh, look at the flashy new guy bringing in the ice cream truck. But it's like, all right, other coaches
playing music in practice.
For,
that's the other big one.
Yeah. Oh yeah, man! I got an email from somebody who's like, I don't think any of us care whether they're playing like whatever rapper it was in practice. Like, doesn't bother us. Like we don't even want to know about it. It's like, all right, well, read the next paragraph of the practice report, my guy. Just divert your eyes, I suppose. But yeah, he's doing that. So he's changed like little things. I guess they entered the stadium a little earlier on game days now. But yeah, I mean, he's kept like the big stuff I think is stuck around. Like the culture is very good. He's said all the right things, really endeared himself to Alabama fans. Sort of, he's embraced kind of the background of the team, hasn't rocked the boat too much yet. So we'll see what happens in like the coming years, but he's handled everything, I think, super well so far. Now, we say the true test comes after your first loss, so that hasn't happened yet. We'll see. We'll see what happens if like Alabama loses to Georgia or drops a game down the line or drops 2 games. You know, how's he handled that when it comes up? Because like, I mean, it's different in the 12-team playoff era. You guys know that, obviously, but I mean, a 10-2 season for Alabama in the past has been like reason for real concern. So that's yet to be determined, I think.
I'm imagining after one loss, like no more music. No, they should actually they should just do a fundraiser.
That's been a thing on message boards when they're playing well and when they're playing poorly against South Florida. You can look on the boards, to like, maybe next week we shut the music off and get to work.
Oh, no. What they got to do, they got to have like a fundraiser, an NIL fundraiser. Whoever donates the most gets to pick the music. You'll end up with like Neil Diamond or something playing for practice. Song blue. Who doesn't feel like hyped up to tackle somebody?
Frankie Valli. We're playing that during practice.
Yeah. But obviously you've talked about a lot of this stuff has just remained the same for the most part. But from the general, because you have been obviously covering the team, and now, as a beat writer, as someone who sees and senses the program, though, what beyond like obviously music or an ice cream truck, what have you felt that seems different in how this coaching staff approaches the team?
So I don't know if this is a hot take, but I think the coaching staff, obviously Kalen DeBoer is not Nick Saban. He's not I'm not saying Kalen DeBoer is as good a coach as Nick Saban, any of that. I think the staff improved over what it's been the past 2 years. Because that was always sort of the ace in the hole for Nick Saban, was having these just all-star staffs, right? Like, he had Kirby Smart and Lane Kiffin as his coordinators at the same time. Stuff like just guys on guys on guys who go become head coaches to varying degrees of success. But but the past few years, that hasn't really been the case, right? Like last year, the defensive coordinator was, Kevin Steele's a good coach, but he was a retread for Alabama. Tommy Rees was probably not like, I don't think I'm speaking out of school to say your first pick at offensive coordinator. In fact, it's been reported it's not his first pick. Like he went after Ryan Grubb, a man who seemingly just does not like to be the offensive coordinator at Alabama. Gets to Tuscaloosa and it's like, I can't do this. So I think that I'd say the staff has perhaps improved kind of across the board. There are a few guys who are still around who are very good coaches, and there were good coaches on last year's staff as well. But I think that's better across the board. And then maybe in the support staff roles, maybe less lunatics. Like it was, Saban sort of built a culture you could succeed in by sort of being nuts. Saban was nuts. And I think maybe you get more there's perhaps more normal human beings in there now. And that's not a better or a worse thing. I think it's just different.
So, look, obviously, it's only been a couple of weeks. They're all respect. Actually, no, not that much respect to Wisconsin. They haven't played a competitive game truly as yet, or an especially good team. But what I will say is some of it is predictive, I understand. But through week 3, Alabama right now is number 2 in SP+, ahead of Texas, ahead of Georgia, only behind Ohio State. And actually, probably the more interesting number to me is Alabama's number 6 in defensive SP+, which does, of course, take into account quality of opponent and all that sort of stuff. I'm curious to focus in on the defense for a second, because I think we all knew that Kalen DeBoer was going to come in and do a great job on offense. And like, I picked Jalen Miller to win the Heisman preseason because I'm like, well, just imagine what Kalen DeBoer is going to do with that dude. But I'm curious on the defensive side of the ball. Do you think that your experience being around watching this team, watching them perform, does it feel in line to say that this is a top 10 defense in the country right now? And how do you think this new staff has kind of added or changed what they're doing?
No, now here's the deal. Obviously, it comes with the disclaimer, like as a beat writer, you don't actually get to watch that much football that's not Alabama just because you're like in a stadium for the 12 hours or whatever on a Saturday. So last week was the first time since the 2021 season I've got to like sit on the couch and watch like 18 games. So, take this with a grain of salt. But yeah, it's a like really, really good defense. I guess my big question was kind of in the secondary. And they've not been like super tested yet, respect or not to Wisconsin. But the tests they've had, they've pretty much passed with flying colors. I think I saw the PFF stat that Domani Jackson is allowing less yards to coverage at cornerback than anyone else. So Nick Saban talked about, to go back, they lost a lot in the secondary to the portal when Nick Saban, who, in addition to all the head coach stuff, is probably the greatest defensive backs coach of all time. So like a lot of guys left, and they lost, Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry went in the NFL draft. So it's pretty much a new unit other than Malachi Moore, who stuck around. Then they got some young guys out there too, like especially Xavier Brown getting a lot of reps at corner. He's been starting out there opposite Domani. But no, they've been really solid. They got 2 good linebackers in the middle in Deontay Lawson and Jahad Campbell, who are both like excellent NFL caliber guys. Up front, LT Overton's been good. Hugh Robinson's played really well, and then on the edge, it's a really, really talented defense, playing in a style that seems to suit them. So yeah, it's the defense. It's done better than I expected it to. Even.
Do you think this wide receiving group because obviously Carson Beck, solid quarterback, but do you think this wide receiving group, along with Beck, Dominic Lovett, Dylan Bell et al., do you think they can be enough to truly challenge that Alabama secondary?
Yeah, I think so. I think Georgia hadn't seemed to have a lot of explosive plays so far this season. And so it almost seems like they're just waiting on somebody to step up. I think in the SEC preview here, I said I thought Dominic Lovett was sort of primed for a big year. And that's just because I saw what he could do as a deep threat when I covered him at Mizzou. Like he just super, super talented guy who's just weirdly not done what I think people expected him to at Georgia so far. But there's certainly guys on that wide receiving core who I see primed to step up, and Carson Beck, obviously good player. So yeah, this will for sure be Alabama's just biggest challenge in the secondary so far.
So I'm curious, when Nick Saban stepped down, when Kalen DeBoer stepped in, look, I am a huge Kalen DeBoer fan. I was a huge Kalen DeBoer fan when he was at Washington. I was frankly a huge Kalen DeBoer fan when he was at Fresno State in Indiana before that. But I thought that just because of transition, that this is probably like a 9-3 team that will look awesome for stretches, that will struggle for stretches. For me, I think that they've been more on top of things than I expected from day one. You've obviously covered the SEC for a couple years at this point, right? You've covered Alabama. You've been around great teams when you covered Missouri. Like, you've seen what championship caliber teams look like in so many ways. Is this a team that it's week 4? I get that. I don't want I don't want you to declare that Alabama's going to win the national championship. But does this look like a team that is far along enough already, in a way that I don't think I expected, that they are a legitimate national title contender?
Yeah, I think so. Now, will I think that after they play Georgia? We'll see. But like through the 3 games so far, I'd say so. Like they're so talented across the board. Like we've talked about how good the roster is. People seem to be in positions that suit them. So like, really the only test is like, does this hold up? They survived as Spencer Hall has taken to calling it, the Stummy Hurts game against South Florida there. But like, this is sort of the last test. Like, how's this hold up against a really, really like elite opponent? And so it's hard to definitively answer at this point. But yeah, from what I've seen so far, they've done what they should do.
One of my last questions for you is, do you think the Kentucky method of nearly corralling Georgia and just also giving that defense fits? Is that something Alabama should be able to exploit? I mean, how much are we going to see Alabama kind of adapt to what Kentucky used, and how much of it do you think is Alabama still going to just use its full abilities and maybe even pass a little bit more than say Kentucky was successfully able to do?
It seemed like, from what everyone has said, now I wasn't at the DeBoer press conference this week because I dropped into Athens to see Kirby Smart, but they watched it, they know kind of what happened, but also there's sort of a sense of like that was just gonna be Georgia's worst game of the season. Georgia does that from time to time against either Kentucky or Missouri, really, where it just like struggles and struggles and struggles to get anything going, but then like somehow manages to win the game because it has every good player. So I think you can learn some things from it, but I think Alabama's just kind of going to do what it does, to borrow a Gary Pinkelism there.
Okay. Last question. How do you see this game going on Saturday?
That's
loaded
a great
question.
Yeah. I've said, like, until like I see Alabama pass like a test, like I guess I'm going to pick Georgia, just because like you sort of know what you're getting at this point out of a Kirby Smart Georgia team. Like, that said, I don't know that I'd like them to cover even 1.5, right? Like, I feel like it's just going to be a super close game, and then sort of whoever wins it at the end or gets a hot hand at some point is going to take the game. So, I mean, if you are asking me right now, but like, I'm 51% on Georgia at this point, but I think it's a close game.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, thank you for joining us. It's always great having you on and hearing your insights into all of it. It's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners agree. If those of you, again, if you want to read Matt Stahl's work, he's on AL.com. Where can people find you outside of AL.com? Because obviously that's where we can read your articles. Where can we find out more stuff about what your observations are on college football?
Still on Twitter. As that thing drives into the ground, but yeah, Matt Stahl 97 over there. I don't tweet as much as I think many beat writers do, but and when I do, it's normally something stupid. But yeah, still hanging out over there for the time being.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, can't wait to see how this game shapes up. It's going to be an exciting one this weekend in Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right. Well, that was great. It's always great talking to Matt. And now that we're back from break, got some games to talk about this weekend. It's week 5. Once again, I mean, we talked about the marquee match, undoubtedly. Number 2, Georgia, at number 4, Alabama. Again, I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it because, I mean, we'll probably, maybe if we have a chance at the end of the show to fit this in, but no one expected, and someone posted this on Reddit, and I had to agree, because did anyone foresee this week's conversations heading into Georgia at Alabama being dominated by Utah State and UNLV discussions? No one saw that coming. No one, no one saw those two teams suddenly, bringing all the spotlight, at least among the more intense college football fans, to see that. I didn't. But going to this game in Tuscaloosa, we heard from Matt. How do you think this is going to actually break down?
Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting game because I think that if you're just looking at the play from this season, there's an argument that Alabama has been the more consistently excellent team in some ways. Obviously, Georgia has that weird game against Kentucky. They do offset it with the way that they played against Clemson, and that's aging pretty well right now. But I mean, Alabama has been so complete this season, is I think the thing that I like the most about them. We talked about it with Matt on defense, but like that's the unit that I think has been their better unit so far. 0 points against Western Kentucky, 16 against South Florida. That was really the thing that prevented them from causing a whole lot of issues. And 10 against Wisconsin. The South Florida thing is continually so interesting to me that Alabama's having issues. I do wonder if it's that South Florida has a little bit of a smaller, more athletic defensive front, so they're willing to and Alabama's got this hulking offensive line. Maybe they just don't move well against them, and that's why they're anyway. This is all a little beside the point. They're going against Georgia, who definitely is a hulking defensive front when you're talking about the Bulldogs. But I think that they'll match up okay with that. I mean, we saw that, of course, last season whenever these two teams played in the SEC title game. I think, like Matt mentioned, I mean, Jalen Milroe's playing at a really high level right now. On the Georgia side, I mean, Kentucky showed some issues in their passing game. Like, they were not consistent. They didn't protect all that well. They didn't run the ball all that consistently in that game. That's a little bit of a warning sign for me because I do think that Alabama is the type of defense that can certainly cause some issues. This might be, I mean, frankly, this might need to be a Carson Beck game. I mean, Carson Beck's kind of been able to sit back and do, kind of be a game manager for so much of his tenure at Georgia. But we saw last year in the game against Alabama that wasn't good enough. And I think that that's going to be this kind of game. So part of this question is, how much do we think that Carson Beck has improved? I think that he has improved. I think he's very good. I think that his playmakers are quite good. The issue is they don't have the sure thing of a Brock Bowers like they did in previous seasons. And I think that they are filling that loss. I'm curious, do we see more Oscar Delp involved at tight end in this game than maybe we have the past couple of games? I totally get the idea of why Georgia's favored, why Matt leaned Georgia, just kind of because Alabama still has to prove themselves under Kalen DeBoer. But Kalen DeBoer just shows up for these big games, man. He does such a good job in these big games. He swept Oregon twice. He beat Texas twice and Steve Sarkisian. Both of those teams were quote unquote better than his Washington teams, I would argue, in terms of pure talent on the field. Oh, yeah. This is the first time that he's heading into one of these games, maybe with the more talented roster at Alabama over Georgia. It's going to be at home. I think that they have the most dynamic offensive player in the game, which if it's not Jalen Milroe, it's Ryan Williams, the freshman receiver. I don't know. I think I'm leaning Alabama in this one, which is not where I expected to be coming into the season.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of leaning in your direction as well, because what we've seen, especially Georgia's offense struggling a bit on third down, and I think it's like 74th in the country right now on third down conversions, and especially a lot of their problems on offense. And I'm not saying severe problems, but the problems we've seen that could be exploited by a team like Alabama, or that when they get thrown off schedule, they're put in a position where it's a passing play. Their success rate's only been 33%. So that's bad. That's something a competent defense and one as talented as Alabama and the coaching staff that they have there. Obviously, we talk about the offense, but obviously, again, there's a great staff there that they put together, as Matt pointed out. I think they're going to be able to exploit that. And yeah, exactly. If I'm Alabama, I force Beck to perform, because we've seen that when the pressure is on, and it is absolutely Georgia's going to have to throw the ball. They're not quite as successful, and that's something that, especially with the talent in that secondary and then just across the defense, Alabama's going to be able to take advantage of. And then on the conversely, I mean, Georgia's given up like 45% of their third downs to opposing offenses. That's 91st in the country. And Alabama's been pretty decent. They're like 53%, so they're like 12th in the nation. Everyone's seen what Kentucky was able to do, and you've got someone like Jalen Milroe who makes third downs a nightmare because of what we've seen him do for 2 seasons now. I think the opportunity is there, being at home, for Alabama to assert itself. I wouldn't be surprised if comes, Sunday, we're going to be talking about like, wow, Alabama never left. Alabama's just reloaded on the coaching staff with a talent that is there. Again, I'm not saying it's going to be a blowout, but I would not be surprised if Alabama's the one to edge out for those reasons. And again, who thought? I mean, this season's been absolutely fascinating. I mean, the only team, and we'll probably talk a little bit about some of these other contenders, this has been one of the pleasant's relative. That's a subjective term, but this has been one of the surprises that I didn't expect to see heading in.
Yeah, I think that it's been a really interesting lead up to this game. One thing I do want to touch on, I think that there's been a huge narrative floating around that this game is getting less hyped or matters less, and it's because of the expanded playoff, and oh no, we ruined college football and all this sort of stuff. I do want to respond to that specifically. We are comparing the hype for this Alabama-Georgia game on September 28th to national title games and conference championship games. These two teams haven't played in September since 2015, when Mark Richt was still the head coach at Georgia. So I think to try to compare the hype for those games to this game is frankly ridiculous in the first place. The other piece, too, is that this is the first time since, again, that 2015 game that this isn't between the number 1 and number 2 teams in the SEC. Texas right now is ranked number 1 in the country. Neither of these two teams are. And on top of all of that, yes, obviously this game is going to get a lot of attention and a lot of people are going to watch this game, and we're going to continue to talk about this game all season long. The reality is, again, no early season conference game is going to get as much hype as a November or December or even in this case, January college football game. It's just silly to kind of look at it like that, frankly. So people want to use that as excuse like, oh no, the expanded playoff has clearly ruined the sport. Nobody cares anymore. And that's just frankly stupid. Because the other piece too is that there are September games that we care about, but they're non-conference games, right? Yeah. Texas went on the road to play Michigan. We talked about that for ages. We talked about that all off season.
And the number one game that was watched just this past weekend was it was technically a conference game, but it was USC Michigan. Yes. So there are those games out there. I almost for a second threw myself games out there. Conference.
100%. And the other piece too is that the Texas Michigan game was one of the most watched games of the past few years, right? Mm-hmm. Because it was a game with major implications that couldn't just be kind of pushed into, oh, well, it's just a conference game, right? Like an early season conference game is not going to be viewed and talked about the same way leading up to it as a standalone game. That's always going to be the case. That was the case in the 4 team. That was the case in the 2 team. It does not matter. And so I just want to end this doomerism over the idea that suddenly games don't matter anymore. Of course they matter. And also, this is a game that I don't think in the same way is going to receive the amount of hype that a November or December game of this usually would. Also because it's usually Kirby versus Saban, the easy number 1 versus number 2 in college football. I actually think, especially by the way, if Alabama wins this game, like we're talking about, this coming out might be one of the most talked about games of the entire year, even if it isn't one of the most coming in.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there's so many ways to refute that kind of thinking. First of all, more games matter. That's certainly that should be the
That's
theme.
another piece.
That should have been the college football playoff motto this season. More games matter, because we're going to be talking about other games in a little bit that are also relevant that we may not have cared about as much. But first of all, the SEC, give them credit. They did a masterful scheduling job this season. I mean, having that Oklahoma Tennessee game last weekend, having Alabama Georgia. Down the road, obviously Texas is going to be playing Georgia down the road. That's going to be I mean, it's fascinating. No matter win or lose, that Georgia-Texas game is going to probably be must-watch no matter what. But if Alabama manages to win this game, they don't play Texas. So we're going to probably see this crazy hype machine about they meet each other in the SEC title game. Everyone's going to be talking about that. So this is absolutely fascinating. This game is going to be an important game. And I absolutely agree. If Alabama manages to win, this is going to be one we all look back at and say, hey, look, that's where Kalen DeBoer asserted himself. But also Georgia, this is going to be their opportunity to show that those early shaky games that we saw were nothing to worry about. It was just Georgia getting themselves back into the zone. Another game we should probably talk about, because there's a couple of there's several ranked on ranked, but the ones that I think are most interesting, Louisville, 15 team we talked about in the offseason. I know one that you were more bullish on, at least earlier in the offseason, is heading to play Notre Dame. They're ranked basically side by side, but of course Louisville's undefeated. Notre Dame took that weird loss that's only looking weirder to NIU and has come back and absolutely clobbered any other teams. They won their second MAC game, which is wonderful. They proved that they're not cursed to the MAC. This is an interesting game. I mean, this feels like both teams probably need to win this to have any shot at the college football playoff, only because the ACC is so weird and shaky right now. And then Louisville losing this game would pretty much, I don't think they'd have a chance, even if they managed to win the conference, because obviously it's a non-conference game, even though Notre Dame is sort of ACC. Notre Dame I don't think they can afford to take another loss. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the big thing with Louisville is that they still have to play Miami at home and on the road against Clemson, the two best teams in the ACC right now. And I think it's possible for them to split those games, but probably not win both. If they win against Notre Dame this week, which I think is very possible, then they put themselves in a position, like you said, to be 11-1, maybe going to the conference title game with a chance to make it either as the winner or an at-large. I think that this is a big game for the ACC specifically for that reason, because if Louisville comes out with a win, I think you're suddenly talking 3 true contenders for at-large spots in Miami, Clemson, and Louisville, as opposed to 2, and it makes the path to 2 much more reasonable. But Notre Dame, obviously a really, really good defense. This is gonna be a hell of an under game. I'll tell you that much, because both of these offenses, I think, are going to struggle to move the ball rather, against some pretty dang good defenses. We've seen Louisville pass the ball pretty well so far this year with Tyler Shuck at quarterback. He's been efficient, completing 68% of his passes, 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. We haven't seen this team, especially this last game against Georgia Tech, which was their one kind of real game that they've played so far. They did not run the ball well at all. Donald Chaney was their leading rusher, 10 carries for 23 yards, only 57 yards on 57 yards rather on 27 attempts. That's not going to do it. I don't think that Louisville can beat Notre Dame playing that way, just frankly. I think that they're going to have to find a way to be just a little bit more efficient running the ball. I do love the fact that they're starting to get Ja'Cory Brooks involved in the passing game. Of course, the former Alabama receiver, he had 125 last week. But I think for Louisville to win this game, they have to run the ball just a little bit better. Because if it's a low-scoring, grinded-out game, that's where Notre Dame lives, right? That's how they beat Texas A&M a couple weeks ago. So I think I lean Notre Dame in this game, but the aspect that I think that can flip it is that running game potentially getting going for Louisville again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's gonna be a good one in Notre Dame Stadium. The third game I wanted us to talk about is one I don't think we expected was going to be as compelling until last Friday, and that is the undefeated Illini, number 19 now, heading in to Happy Valley to play Penn State, number 9. been expecting Penn State to be a strong team, and they have been. Everyone seems to struggle against Bowling Green, so that game seems a lot less weird. That game is still Bowling Green is probably the weirdest team out there that has no chance of any contention. But just seeing their score lines and the conniption fits they give to other programs, credit to you, Falcons. But heading into this game, I mean, what do we make of this? Has Brett Bielema got a better team than people expected, or was it a bit of luck? Was it the fact that, again, as awesome as Dylan Raiola is, he's a freshman, and maybe the Nebraska just is cursed because a one-score game they're destined to lose in overtime. It's just what they do. I think, by the way, somebody pointed out it's been like 8 overtimes and Nebraska just simply hasn't scored any points. Like in 8 overtimes,
since 2014.
That is like. There's a point where it's not chance. There's a point where it just becomes like destiny. First destiny. But going back, but okay, Nebraska, you're set aside now. But what do you make of this game in Happy Valley? I don't even know. Like, it's like an unexpected surprise that suddenly the homecoming game in Beaver Stadium is actually a ranked game with implications.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? I mean, I think that. So Illinois, I want to give them their flowers. They are absolutely better than we expected, regardless of what happens the rest of the year. I think that that's true. For them to be in a position where they're easily going to make a bowl game, that was not something that was assumed at the beginning of the year, and especially was not assumed with their early schedule, having to play Kansas in week 2 and Nebraska in week 4. What I will say is this is a major stress test for this team to go on the road and play Penn State. We've talked about Penn State before. They're our Mendoza line of the Big Ten. If you beat them, then you're a good Big Ten team. If you don't beat them, you're probably not necessarily a good team, but even if you're pretty good. Going on the road, I think that makes it even more difficult to have to play in Happy Valley instead of at Illinois. But, here's the thing that I'll say, is that they have been so diverse offensively in a way that I really just did not expect, to be frank. Caden Fegan is the running back who stepped up. They obviously, so much of what they do is in the run game and the way that they block, and that's what Brett Bielema teams are defined by. But they've also gotten extremely efficient quarterback play from Luke Altmaier. And actually, in that game, like you mentioned, against Nebraska, the experience of Altmaier versus the inexperience of Raiola was a huge part of how that game ended. On the game-winning touchdown throw, right? It was Altmaier who immediately recognized, they had a coverage bust. They didn't realize what they were doing. Immediately gets him the ball. And, that's a veteran play. That's something that happens because you recognize something with a lot of experience. So I do think that this is a team that will be able to compete with Penn State. I think the question for me is going to be, are they able to hang for 4 quarters in the trenches with what Penn State does? I mean, Penn State is so physical. They're so aggressive. Abdul Carter, of course, a terror off the edge. And then I think that offensively, I mean, Penn State has really found something with some of the misdirection stuff that they do with Andy Kotelnicki. Ironically, right, Illinois plays Andy Kotelnicki's old team in week 2 and manages to spook them. And then now they play the master himself in week 5. So I think that it'll be interesting to kind of see what they're able to take from that matchup. Obviously, a lot of the stuff that Kansas does is still built on what Andy built there. I think, though, that especially with the game being at Penn State, I think that I lean Penn State in this game. It'll be close. It'll be competitive. I think that it'll probably be a relatively low-scoring game, but I do think that Penn State, just with the infrastructure that they have in the trenches, I lean that direction.
Yeah, I think that's a safe lean. I mean, it's fascinating. If Illinois manages to pull it off and pull off an upset, they will have won back-to-back in 2 tough environments. That people, I mean, we'll have to just say you don't just go into Nebraska and Penn State and, those are tough environments. But, regardless, win or lose, Illinois, good job, guys. You guys have put yourself on a radar that I don't think any of us thought heading into the season, certainly not in preseason polls and especially media polls of the Big 12, probably the Big 12. My goodness, where am I, Bobak? The Big 10. Speaking of the rest of the games, I'll just mention one more really quick. One ranked and should be ranked game that we're going to be talking about almost certainly next week is Wazoo, which is sort of ranked. They're right outside. So we'll call it number 26 Wazoo hosting number 25 Boise State, a team we decided to keep as our G5 rep. And most of the reason is because this will be, I'm not sure, the UNLV game is still out there, but UNLV, we'll talk about that maybe at the end. But that is going to be one of those important games for Boise State. You nearly knock off Oregon. We've talked about that. They were expected to lose that game, but they made it closer than anyone expected. And we're still not even certain, was it because Oregon was still off because of that previous Idaho game? They looked strong the week after against Oregon State. There's a whole layer of questions to that. But this seems to be the game where we're going to see if Boise State is truly the G5 contender. I mean, they got Ashton Jeanty. They've got a good group of players around him. And I hate to phrase it that way, but he is such a talent. Wazoo's just been fascinating. They're undefeated, by the way, folks. I mean, and remember, the Pac-2 can only get in as an at-large. So they're kind of like they're kind of the darling right now if they can somehow manage to slap together a winning season that puts them into those higher ranks up there. That Boise State would also be a great win for them as well. What do you make of this game?
Well, I'll tell people to pay attention to CBSSports.com, where I may or may not have a piece on Washington State going up in the next few hours. But this is a really interesting game because, like you said, I mean, Boise State has been the team in so many ways in the Mountain West this season because of the stars that they have. Of course, Ashton Jeanty being the main one at running back, but also Ahmed Hassanian on the defensive line, a big time player who's going to play in the NFL. I think that they've gotten a lot from Maddox Madsen to this point at quarterback. Like, they just have found good ways to play football. Like, I don't have a better way to phrase it than that. And I think that they are a very deserving ranked team. The thing that Washington State brings to the table is a level of creativity and chaos that, frankly, I mean, they won the Apple Cup that way. They beat Texas Tech by 21 points that way. And that Texas Tech team has rebounded, and that game is only aging better the way that they were able to win that game. I got a chance to talk for the story to Jake Dickert yesterday. And what he kind of said was, look, we had a lot of players who were developing and decided to stick around. Like, yeah, we lost some of our top end guys, but like, we felt like our depth was already coming along, and those guys decided to stay. And so they feel like, oh, we still have a, power 4, whatever caliber roster because of it. So this is going to be, I think, a really interesting matchup. What it's going to come down to, I think, in so many ways, is which team is able to stop the explosive play better. Of course, we've seen with Ashton Jeanty, I mean, he's been able to get his numbers against anybody and everybody, and that includes the University of Oregon. So that's going to be tough for, I think, Washington State to stop.
For those who may not have paid attention late on Saturday night, Wazoo survived San Jose State in double overtime 54-52. So that defense, and again, they both played Portland State. That 70-30 win. You still out 30 to Portland State, a team that had failed the Oregon Trail and had to cancel a game, and then played Boise State, who held them to only 14 points versus 30. But I just want to point that out. Like that to me is the other thing. I'm like, can Wazoo stop anybody?
No, it's a fair question. And so I think that for me, on the Washington State side, right, like, it's John Mateer. He's been so dynamic for them at quarterback, both in the passing game and in the running game. He's been efficient. He hasn't made all too many mistakes to this point. But I think that Boise State is just a more diverse team to this point. They're able to attack in more ways, to me, than Washington State is able to at this point. I think that they'll be able to bait John Mateer potentially into some mistakes. And look, I mean, you look at the game that Washington State had against Texas Tech, which is probably their best game overall when you talk about the way that they were able to win. I mean, Texas Tech had 4 turnovers in that game to 1 for Washington State, but they outgained them by 80 yards. That's a little bit of a sign of concern for me when you talk about heading into matches like this. I don't think that Boise State is going to make the same number of mistakes as Texas Tech did in their game. I think that I think Boise State is a much more effective offense than Washington has right now after all the turnover that they had. So in many ways, I think Boise State is the best team that they've played to this point. I'm going to lean Boise State to take this game.
Yeah, I think that's a safe bet. There's some other games, and we're just going to be mostly testing how teams are doing. We don't necessarily have to get too into depth on them, but obviously, number 3, Ohio State's going to probably play a team with a pulse when they go on the road to play Michigan State. Although Michigan State is very unpredictable, but
I don't know if there's a pulse there.
You don't feel it's a step up in competition for the Buckeyes,
I mean, technically, I guess. It's a step up in the context of what they've done to this point. Where, they're not even playing bodies at this point. They're playing like ashes. They're playing like cremated bodies to this point. Now you get maybe a dead body to test yourself out.
I have a scenario for you.
Okay,
Can you imagine we get a very close, like maybe even overtime Alabama-Georgia game, and we watch next week's AP rankings be like, the winner of that game, Texas, the loser of that game, and then Ohio State moves to 4. That will cause just such consternation in Columbus. I can't even imagine.
It'll be interesting. I mean, I think this will be a good test, not just for Ohio State, but I think that this will be a good test for Michigan State, just to kind of take stock of where they are, because they have, of course, early this season. They have a win over Maryland by 3 points. Maryland doesn't look all that good, though. That game against Boston College, they lose 23-19. That's not terrible to this point, right? But this is going to be by far the best defense that they've played to this point. And Aiden Chiles, their really, really good quarterback, has showed all the reasons we're excited about him, and also all the reasons that we were worried about him. 4 touchdowns, 7 interceptions to this point. But I think that it'll just be kind of fun to see what their defense is able to do against. But that's the thing, is that Ohio State can win this game. They probably can win this game only playing defense. They probably don't even need their offense to score points, because I bet their defense will get a defensive score at some point, and that might be the ball game, the way that Michigan State is going to play them on that side of the ball. So I will say there is one other game that I really want to touch on that I think is an elimination game in a lot of ways, and that's Oklahoma State versus Kansas State. Mm-hmm. And the reason that I say that is that both teams lost last week in Big 12 play. Oklahoma State was down 22-3 against Utah. They managed to storm back, make it 23-19, make it look like the game was close. It was not. Kansas State lost a very weird game last week against BYU, where they go on the road and outgain them by more than 100 yards and still lose the game. So when you look at this game, so first of all, if either of them are going to get in as an at-large, they can't afford another loss. They have to be an 11-1 team heading into the Big 12 title game. The other piece of this too, though, is that I actually looked at the numbers. From 2017 on, when the Big 12 brought back their Big 12 title game, a 2-loss team has been left out 3 different times. So being 7-2 in Big 12 play is not enough to guarantee yourself a spot in the Big 12 title game. Now we're talking an even bigger league where there are going to be more teams potentially in that 7-2 range. And the other piece too is that tiebreakers are going to be huge when we get to the end of the year. And if you don't have the tiebreaker heading into this matchup, that's a big part of how Oklahoma State got into the Big 12 title game last year, was that they had tiebreakers over Kansas State and Oklahoma. So this is a huge game in terms of shaping up the Big 12 race. It's going to be an interesting one. Look, Kansas State's offense is running the ball at an incredibly high level and is not passing the ball at an incredibly high level. Oklahoma State's offense is okay in the passing game, but their running game has been non-existent to this point. Actually, Ollie Gordon doesn't have 50 yards rushing in a game against an FBS opponent to this point. And Kansas State is, after Utah, probably the best defense that Oklahoma State has played to this point. So I lean Kansas State in this one, and I think that, again, that's going to make it very difficult for Oklahoma State to get back in the Big 12 title race.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a game that had to be mentioned because of those circumstances. 2 other games, we don't have to get into them, but I'm very curious to see how Wisconsin tests USC at home, especially after that loss, to see if USC can kind of get themselves back in order, if they're going to stay in a position to be a potential at-large team. And Clemson as well. Stanford surprised us last week by taking out Syracuse, and again, that should be another test to see if Clemson is continuing its recovery from that opening loss to the Bulldogs. Now, G5, I'm not going to get too much into it. We talked about Boise State. There's some interesting games. I mean, as we're recording this, it's still Thursday in the middle of the day. So Army is undefeated. They're going to Temple. Liberty's at App State. We'll see. Appalachian State has not looked strong. But, I mean, everyone's curious to see if Liberty's going to finally burst that balloon. James Madison hosts Ball State. Probably not going to be much of a challenge there. Navy undefeated at UAB. South Florida at Tulane might be interesting in the later, especially if we start talking about the American being in the picture again. But we'll put that one on the barn burner. Or I should say on the back burner. Then you got Texas State, Sam Houston in NRG Stadium. I mean, the only game I really want to talk about, though, really briefly, Fresno State's going to UNLV. UNLV. Haj Malik Williams, we were just talking about that early in the show. He's another transfer quarterback they got from FCS, from Campbell. Seems to be a good quarterback, as noted by your colleague at CBSSports.com, Brandon Marcello. He's a prolific player at Campbell. All of this story, this is like the game of the G5 that seems outside of Boise State, the most fascinating drama, because again, as we said, UNLV's already making stories because the question was, between the Mountain West and Pac-12, how that was going to shake down. But meanwhile, we got a whole personnel question going on there. So what do we make of this? Do you think UNLV, I just set that aside. What do you think?
So a couple weeks ago, UNLV's coaching staff was asked, and they said, we feel like we have 3 quarterbacks that we can win with. I mean, that's reality, right? They brought in a lot of different players to replace, people might remember, Jaden Mayava, who was a fantastic freshman for them. But it seemed like in some ways they were setting up the idea that, hey, maybe we might not be with Matthew Sluka for the entire season, which frankly could also be like because of injuries and stuff with the way that he runs. So Haj Malik Williams transferred in from Campbell. He actually was, I believe, a 5 or 6 year player at Campbell. So he is, needless to say, an experienced and prolific player, like you mentioned. Threw for 2,500 yards last year. I think he gives them a little bit more in the passing game while still giving them something in the running game. He was only about a 3.8 yards per carry player at Campbell, but I mean, it's a different kind of offense. It's a different kind of game that you're trying to run. Certainly, they would have brought him in because they thought he also has a little bit of rushing ability as well. And he averaged 39 yards rushing per game across his career, which is pretty solid. So I don't think that there's going to be a huge drop-off. I think there will be a drop-off, but UNLV to this point, I mean, they have been good everywhere, right? Like they're running the ball at a high level. They're playing defense at a high level. They've been able to get stops against even or against power conference opponents. So I still think that UNLV is ultimately going to be able to keep trucking along. And, again, they didn't get a lot in the passing game from Matthew Sluka. He was a 43% completion guy. I think that you're going to get closer to 60% from Haj Malik Williams. And the question is, again, can he be quite as dynamic in the running game? I think he's going to be able to be a factor, though.
Yeah, because I noticed Sluka when I was looking at, and people may have noticed on the back end of that story, the whole drama of him leaving and redshirting after, because again, with the redshirt rules, after you can play 3 games. So after 3 games, some dispute over NIL, he's like, I'm out. All right, fine. Good luck with that. And then one of the running backs decided to announce they're also leaving. And people are like, oh, has UNLV lost control of the program? But then when you actually looked at the first thing I did is like, well, what are his stats? And then you see the first 3 games, he goes from like 16 carries to 1 carry against Kansas. And he's like, okay, I'm going to be out of here. And then Adam Rittenberg noted that like he had planned to do this over a week ago. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, and then meanwhile, USC Bear Alexander then immediately announces like, I'm also redshirting. Well, again, playtime comes a factor, and we get that. I'm not actually saying those players shouldn't do that. I mean, that's a legit reason to transfer. That's why the portal's been great. But it's fascinating to see how this is going to work out and what this is going to mean. I'm not saying he's going to do this. Can you imagine if you lose a quarterback that way, and then the next quarterback plays 3 games, does well, and is like, you know what? I think I'm also going to enter the portal. I love that. I'm not saying I hope that doesn't happen to UNLV, but that would be absolutely that would be fascinating. Oh my God. I love the word. People are like, oh, this is ruining the sport. No, it isn't. It's as interesting as ever because we're talking about more games and we're talking about personnel midseason stuff that has never come up before. At least not at this level, which hypothetically was possible. We kind of were all expecting it was going to eventually happen, but yeah, who knew it was going to be UNLV and it was going to be over a verbal promise. I'm going to just say this. as someone who is an attorney, let me tell all of you listening, if you ever have real money at stake, get it in writing. Get it in writing, folks. His agent apparently didn't know you could negotiate when he was enrolled. Like, hire people who know what they're doing, folks. I'm not going to say anything more about that agent, but like, when you need, when there's adult amounts of money, hire an adult. Please don't. I'm not saying hire me because I don't represent clients like that, but find someone who does. That's my personal advice. You listen to this podcast, we are giving you life advice here. That is the best life advice. And get a prenup. That's my other one, but we'll set that aside. But all that said,
no, I won't.
I think it's a good chance to wrap this one up before I go on another one of my rambling rants here. But just wanted to thank all of y'all for listening to us. Thanking our guest, of course, Matt Stahl, who is here to talk about that interesting Georgia-Alabama game we got coming up. You can always find his work at AL.com. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Again, like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CBS. At CBS. At CBS. At CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for joining, everyone.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.